Hello, you are welcome back to Straight Talk Africa. And for reaction, I am now joined by Professor PLO Lumumba, a Pan-Africanist motivational speaker and professor of public law. I have to say, Professor, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on this special edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Shaka. You are yourself an icon in the African journalism scene, and I'm very glad that you've given me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you this evening in East Africa and this morning in the United States of America.
Profoundly honored for your compliments and support, Professor Lumumba.
Thank you.
Really, let me register on behalf of Straight Talk Africa and Shaka Extra Time. I would like to extend our profound, heartfelt condolences on the passing away of President John Pombe Magufuli of Tanzania, a man that you so admired very much.
That is fit and appropriate that we really appreciate and almost venerate a man who within 5 years has made such an impact not only in the United Republic of Tanzania, but in the continent of Africa, and one dare say the world.
Briefly, what kind of man was he really? What made him tick for you?
Magufuli must be understood in the context of his history as a student of Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. He served fundamentally after the early Nyerere regime, but he is a cadre of the Chama cha Mapinduzi, and you and me know that Chama cha Mapinduzi is a political party that has a culture and philosophy. And to the extent that he grew up within that culture, one must say that there is some Nyerereism in them. And one may ask, what is Nyerereism? Nyerereism, from where I sit, means the appreciation that an African must have self-esteem, that an African must believe that Africa can solve our problems. An African must believe that the resources of the continent should be utilized for the benefit of the continent, and in a narrower way, that if one is a Tanzanian, one must use one's position for the general good. That is how I understand Magufuli, and he is a go-getter. That's why he had the moniker, the bulldozer, when he was in charge of the road sector in Tanzania.
The bulldozer, indeed. How do you respond to some who were not as impressed by him as you were, who, as a matter of fact, in their words, not mine, regard him as an autocrat?
There is a sense in which it's very easy to label. And those who are his political opponents have no shortage of harsh words to describe his tenure in office. But it is the famous French philosopher Saint-Just who said, no one can rule guiltlessly. No matter what you do, there'll always be critics. And I think it is America's Delano Roosevelt who said that we should not worry about critics, individuals who live between the twilight of victory and defeat, and whose greatest claim is to find a problem for every solution. So he'll be criticized, he will be castigated, he'll be called names, but we've got to judge him on the basis of the mandate that the people of Tanzania elected him to discharge. He was elected as the president of the United Republic of Tanzania, and if you ask any average Tanzanian on a scale of 1 to 10, they'll say he scored over 8. But critics will be there.
Very interesting. If you were to talk to us from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your Kenyan heart and soul, what made President Magufuli really tick? What was his vision think?
My view is this was an individual who found himself through very serendipitous circumstances, if you may, as the President of the Republic of Tanzania. He was not the obvious choice during the delegates' meeting, and he told me this himself. And he finds himself in that position, and he was animated by the desire to do good. He was animated by the desire to ensure that the legacy bequeathed to him by his predecessors and the founding father of the nation was to be given impetus. And he therefore went about his duties with a sense of urgency, with a sense, some may say, a sense of impatience, with a sense of dignity, with a sense of seeking to achieve that which he was called to do. And he did it in a manner that did ruffle feathers. He made quite a number of people uncomfortable, and one may say that he was a humanist, a man who was hungry to ensure that his people's lives changed for the better. It is therefore not lost on me that during his short tenure of 5 years, not a single sector of the Tanzanian economy has not been positively touched. And in that regard, he was bound to ruffle feathers, particularly from the neo-colonizers, and I'm using this word very guardedly, who thought that his administration was business as usual, would continue to reap and benefit from the mining sector, from the agricultural sector, from the infrastructure sector. He annoyed many. And remember that he also came at a time when the Tanzanian opposition was beginning to grow wings. And typical with many African oppositions, the agenda is to oppose everything and to propose nothing. And he had to confront those people in a very robust manner. Sometimes they thought that he was a little bit intolerant, and that is going to be debated by historians going forward.
Talking about the opposition and talking about allegations that he was perhaps intolerant, what about some of his critics who said, yes, Tanzania may have adopted the multi-party system in the 1990s, but that up to date, Tanzania functions on a template on one-party state.
You know, there may be merit in that kind of assertion, but let us ask ourselves, what have the opposition parties done to ensure that they have their tentacles spread around Tanzania? You are dealing with the Chama cha Mapinduzi, which was formed out of Afro-Shirazi and TANU, that has been on the political scene since independence. And therefore, if you want to dislodge it, it takes a lot more than ramping up the emotions of young people in urban areas. We are talking about a country that is 80% rural. And for that reason, sometimes the opposition confuses the adulation, the apparent adulation that they get in urban areas where there is unemployment for popularity. But when the chips are down, this is a party that has deep tentacles, and the opposition parties must blame themselves. In fact, I think one of the Benjamin William Mkapa did at one time tell the opposition in Tanzania, you are not going to be a credible opposition party until you are able to get into the hearts and minds of Tanzania, which heart and mind has been occupied by Chama cha Mapinduzi for decades. So the opposition must really examine how they approach the issue of dealing with a party as old as CCM. As we see, if you permit me a little comparison, as you see in South Africa with ANC, as you see in Namibia with SWAPO, as you see in Angola with MPLA, as you see in Mozambique with Frelimo. It is not easy. As you see in Rwanda with RPF, as you see in Uganda with NRM, which are much younger parties.
We spoke to one of the major Tanzanian opposition politicians, Tundu Lisu, a man who during the last election, competed for the presidency. He was not that very complimentary. You and I know, of course, that he lives in exile in Belgium, a country that he once called home. How do you react to his allegations, for example?
I know Tundu Lisu is my professional colleague. I respect him. I think the last time I met Tundu Lisu was at a conference in Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, and we had a short conversation. I sympathized with him that he was the victim of a shooting in Tanzania, but I've listened to some of his comments, and they are very uncharitable. In an African setting, you cannot have enmity with a person who is sick. You cannot have enmity with a person who is dead. That is the African tradition. All death cures all. You can only engage in an assessment of their performance. My friend Tindi is too angry. And sometimes when you are too angry, you cease to get things from their perspective. There is a beautiful saying in Kiswahili, mgala muwe lakini haki yake mpe, that you can kill the Gala, which was a tribe, but do appreciate the good that he has done. There is a sense in which if you choose to dismiss President Magufuli wholesale, then you lose even those who sympathize with you, because the extant evidence does reveal that he discharged his mandate and discharged it well. And discharged it well. So to that extent, I find fault with the very angry approach that my good friend Tindi has taken. I think he ought to be more measured. I've said before, and I say it now, if he continues on the trajectory which it is, and he purges himself of the anger which now resides in his mind and heart, and which he spews like venom, then he will lose the traction that he is already getting in Tanzania. If he were measured, if he empathized with the situation, even those whose hearts he had not won may say, behold a leader. Because leadership is judged in times of crisis, and how you react to crisis. You remember those infamous words of Malcolm X when JF Kennedy had been assassinated, and he said, the chicken have come home to roost. He was never forgiven for those words. And I think that we ought to be very measured when we are talking about fellow human beings, even when they have harmed us.
Talk to me again from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your Kenyan heart and soul. What would you say is perhaps the single most important accomplishment of President John Pombe Magufuli during the last 5 years as president?
President John Joseph Pombe Magufuli demonstrated to the world that using your resources and using them prudently and judiciously, you can improve the quality of the lives of your people without being beholden to international institutions. That you can demonstrate to the world that Africans have self-esteem, and that if you want to deal with Tanzania, you ought to deal with Tanzania on their own terms, and you ought to deal with them in a manner that is symbiotic and mutually beneficial. He also demonstrated that you can preside over a nation which you have inherited, which is generally united, and keep it as such. And if there was any doubt, the effervescence with which he was sent to his Mecca is indicative of how he was held by the ordinary Tanzanian.
What about his single most regrettable decision?
I think there is a sense in which his response to the COVID situation would have been informed with greater appreciation of science. I understand how he reacted by saying we ought not to be captured by fear. But the manner in which he articulated his response to the COVID situation gave his critics the opportunity to declare him a denier. And I hold the view, in as much as we trust in God, we must also remember that God has equipped us with intelligence, and science is a part of that intelligence. I do know as a fact that Tanzania did not reject science, that Magufuli did not reject science. He actually did, in the very early days, close the schools and introduce all protocols. But because he's dealing in an environment where there is no shortage of people who are trying to misconstrue your statement, he fell victim and he became fodder for the misrepresentation, particularly of certain segments of the press. And perhaps he could have articulated his opposition a little better, knowing as he should have that he had no shortage of enemies in the Western and Westernized press.
Wait a minute, Professor Lumumba. Here is a man with an earned PhD in chemistry. And yet, this same man did not seem to have respect for his fellow scientists, did not seem to listen to his public health officials. He did not, for example, encourage or allow the country to collect, gather data, and share it with the World Health Organization. Why would he behave like that? A man with a PhD in chemistry. A man, reportedly, who taught
Shaka, let me contextualize. Remember two things. That when in the month of March in the year 2020, WHO declared the COVID pandemic, Tanzania started doing what other countries were doing in terms of gathering statistics and making them known to the public on a daily basis. Remember that when the Malagasy Institute of Applied Science came up with some medicine called COVID Organic, it was Tanzania, Equatorial Guinea, and Ghana which were the first to order it. Remember that he closed all the schools. Remember that he told the world that he had taken samples, some from goats and some from some other animal and human. Yes. And when they were tested, the scientists were incapable of making the differentiation. So that here was a man who tested the science. Perhaps his only failing in that regard was to assume that science is not exact. And particularly when you have a mutating virus such as the one that we are talking about, there is bound to be mistakes at the very beginning. But also remember this, Shaka, that the approach that was taken by Tanzania was to some extent this approach that was taken by Sweden, that you would have herd immunity. The same approach was also taken to a certain extent by Taiwan. The same approach taken to a certain extent by South Korea. And one could argue that part of the reason why Tanzania received the flack is that there are institutions in the world who hold the view that it is the duty of African countries to swallow line, hook, and sinker everything that is handed down to them. And if you as much as interrogate them, then you are labeled, you are vilified, you are maligned, and you are called all sorts of names. That is not to take away my earlier assertion that even when you doubt science, you've got to give it the benefit of doubt, because what science has helped human beings achieve is unfathomable, and it cannot be dismissed with a waving of a hand.
Let's talk about an issue that he has been lauded for, and that was the issue of fighting against corruption and graft. How do you respond, for example, to accusations from Tundu Lisu, who you know as well as I do, is not only a lawyer, but in fact is a former president of the Tanganyika Law Society, who says that in fact, to the contrary, that President Magufuli's fight against corruption, in his view, was selective.
That argument is one that I've always had, that whenever you are fighting corruption, it will always be said it is selective, is targeted towards your opponent. But what is wrong with selection? Let me just confront the question that way. You've got to start somewhere. And you start by selecting individuals who bear the greatest responsibility. Ultimately, they will belong to some opposition party or belong somewhere. But the fact that you are fighting it and you have started somewhere does not mean that that is the end of it. And if it is true that the individuals who are targets were engaged in corruption, why not? So that argument is one that is dead on arrival, is one that is used everywhere where the fight against corruption is mounted. But let us look at the results. I had the opportunity of having a one-on-one conversation with President John Joseph Pombe Magufuli in Dar es Salaam. And he gave me this example, which permit me to give, that when he was closing, his administration ordered the closure of all forex bureaus, he received flack. And he gave me an example that there was one forex bureau whose equipment was seized, and their documents showed that they had only received 40 billion Tanzanian shillings. When they went into their equipment during the relevant year, they had actually transacted 1 trillion Tanzanian shillings. In other words, sometimes to deal with this grand theft, which my friend Boima Fanbule of Liberia calls theft on an industrial scale, you've got to move and move firmly, and you'll be called names, you'll be told you are selective. But in my view, as long as the job is being done, it is Martin Luther King Jr., Shaka, who once famously said that if you listen to every criticism that is directed against you in the fight against that which is good and just, you would never do anything except respond to criticism. The choice is yours when you're in a position of power. And sometimes, and you have been in a position of authority, when you are in a position of authority of whatever kind, you must be sensitive, empathetic, and compassionate, but sometimes you've got to be measuredly ruthless. And I'm using the word ruthless very guardedly, because there are people who are quick to latch on. You see, you hear, he's saying people can be ruthless. I'm using it very guardedly, and I ought to be understood contextually.
Quoting, of course, the great Martin Luther King Jr., he also once said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Correct.
What about the fact, for example, that Magufuli is accused for singling out his neighborhood of Chato for development over and above other areas in Tanzania? As a matter of fact, Tundu Lisu went to the extent of talking about how Magufuli, in his view, was corrupt, just in the same way that Mobutu Sese Seko was a banger of former Zaire and now the Democratic Republic of Congo, became so corrupt that he took most of the resources to develop his home area of Badorite. He even further went to give an example of the Ivorian founding president, Houphouët-Boigny, a man, of course, as you know, has the reputation of having built a Catholic basilica in Yamoussoukro for more than $200 million from the state coffers, which he said was from his pockets. And he built it in an area that was predominantly occupied by Muslims. How do you respond to that?
You know, Shaka, Tundu, who is my very good friend, understands Swahili perfectly. He's a perfect Swahili speaker, and I hope he's listening to us. In Kiswahili, there is a saying, anaye kutusi hakuchagulii tusi. He or she who wants to insult you does not choose the kind of insult. He has decided to insult President Magufuli, and he'll use any insult that comes to his mind and mouth. When he makes such allegations, I've been to Chato, I had been to Badolite, I've been to Yamoussoukro. You cannot begin to compare the two places. And you only have to travel across Tanzania. I was in Dar es Salaam only the other day. See the kind of development that has taken place in Dar es Salaam. I've been to Mwanza. See the kind of development that has taken place in Mwanza. See the railway line that is running from Dar es Salaam to Morogoro and is soon going to Mwanza. See the airport that is being done there. See the gold buying centers, 27 of them. See the gas that are stretched from Mtwara to Tanzania. See the Mwalimu Nyerere hydroelectric power, which is about to be completed and is going to generate 2,000 megawatts of power. The evidence on the ground contradicts Tundu's assertion so very thoroughly that if he were to be asked to substantiate beyond the sound bites, he would find himself in a very difficult position.
There's no doubt that President Magufuli has done some sort of remarkable job or work, really, on, in some cases, providing the infrastructure.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed. Talk to us about what you think, at least in your view, will be the long-term legacy of President John Pombe Joseph Magufuli.
John Joseph Pombe Magufuli will be remembered as a patriot of Tanzania, as a daring leader who dared to do what he considered to be in the best interests of his country without caring what the rest of the world said, as long as the people who had elected him to govern accepted that he was doing the right thing. And I think that that is very important, that the people that gave you the mandate, when they are asked almost to a man or to a woman, if they say kudos to you, then that is a testament to your patriotism. And that must also be combined with what I considered to be his Pan-African credentials, the belief that Africans are capable of using their resources for the benefit of their people and to resolve their conflicts within the confines of the continent. History will remember him fondly on those two accounts.
You remind me that what we really need to do is to focus on the forest rather than the trees, because the trees will...
Indeed.
Well, on that note, Professor Lumumba, I have to say once again that I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have had the opportunity to interact with you. Thank you very, very much, sir.
Thank you very much, and I wish you a good day. Stay safe, stay strong, stay happy.
Thank you, sir, and have a